If you've done anything with form validation in AngularJS, you probably know that this data structure that Angular attaches to the scope and that has information both about the form and all of the inputs inside, this data structure becomes very important. Because, for example, currently, I don't have any validations on username. And if I go out and search for username in this data structure, there is a property attached to the data structure that represents the input. And I can look at the $error property, which is a hash object, and I can see it's empty, which means there's currently no errors associated with that username input. But I want to start adding validations using HTML attributes like required, min, max, pattern, and so forth, and I want to be able to handle the display of error messages on my own. In other words, I want to tell the browser not to use its built-in validations on this form. That's the purpose of the noValidate attribute. That way Chrome will not pop up validation messages, and instead it will be my responsibility to pop up error messages. Let me refresh the page with these changes and do another search for username. And now I can see in the property that username does have an error. The current validation that is failing is the required validation. I know that because the property is there and it has the value of true. So how can I tell the user that the field they're ignoring is currently required? Well, one thing I could do is add some color to the input. You can see the border turn red. Both username and email addresses, they are required. And this will happen just because Angular will add some specific CSS classes to input that will describe the state of that input. So the classes associated with username will tell me that it's currently invalid, and it's invalid because it's required, meaning the user hasn't typed anything here as yet. But if I at least put one character in there, I can now see that this input is touched, it's dirty, but it's also valid. And I can use those classes to display this red border. That's something that I already had set up from a previous module. It was set up in my style sheet. If I open up site.css, one of the first rules I have here is that if you have an input that is touched, that is invalid, then please display a 2-pixel solid red border. And that is a CSS class that will add the red here, but it won't add that red until after the user has interacted or touched that particular input. But it would also be nice to have a textual description of what is wrong. And for that, one of the things I could use is the new ng messages feature. This was introduced with Angular 1.3. I'm going to add a div here with a class of help block. That's another Bootstrap class commonly associated with forms. This is a help block for this particular form input. And it's inside of here where I will use ng messages. And I have to tell ng messages what to look at to determine when there is an error. So for this particular input, I would want it to look at profile form.username.$error. That is that property that we were just looking at, where Angular will add a property to that object required true whenever this input is failing the required validation. And this is true for all the other HTML5 validation attributes too. If I'm on an input type number and I specify a min and a max, those will be added to the error object. And now what I can have are divs that are a specific message for one of the validation properties. So div ng message equals required is a way of saying, please show this div when this property appears on this object. And now if I save everything and come back to the page and refresh, that text is going to appear right from the start. Now I know a lot of people don't want to show any error messages until after the user has had a chance to interact with this form, and that's something that you could do with style rules. Specifically, if you use CSS and use classes that Angular adds to elements like ng-touched and ng-submitted, that will give you the ability to control DOM elements and when they appear. So you might only want an error message to appear after the user tries to submit the form or after they have tabbed out or touched a particular input. What we're going to do here is something a little bit simpler, which is just to always show these messages, and we'll worry about coloring them in just a bit. But again, we are in a situation where I would have to take a div like this with ng message inside and copy it for every form input that I have that requires some validation. Unfortunately, Angular makes this a little bit easier. Instead of specifying each individual message inside of ng messages, I can use another attribute value here, ng messages include, to tell Angular about a template that contains all of the messages that I might want to display. Let me open up a template that I already have built. it is inside of here where I already have messages defined to tell Angular what to display if we are failing a required validation, or a min validation, or a max validation, or if an input type equals email doesn't look like it has a valid email address as yet. And I can just reuse all these messages by saying please include templates messages.html. But I'm still not looking forward to having this markup inside of every single div that has a form element inside. So once again, I want to turn to that custom directive form input and see if it just cannot add an ng messages block for me. Unfortunately, this isn't too difficult to do. Inside of form input, after I have set up the DOM, I want to add messages to this particular element. But in order to do so, I'm going to need some additional information. Essentially what I need to do is dynamically build this div that has the ng messages directive. And in order to do that properly, I'm going to need to know the name of the form, the name of this input, and then build a string that has form.inputName.$error at the end. So getting the name of the input is relatively easy. I already have access to the DOM element. I just need to ask it for its name attribute. Figuring out the form name can be a little bit trickier, but fortunately, that can be easy if I just require the form controller. So remember, require is a list of the controllers that you want passed into your linking function. So now I should be able to get scope, element, attributes, and the form controller. So when I add messages, I'm going to pass along this form, the element that I'm working with. I also want the name of the input. Now, since setup DOM has to find the input, it might be easiest for it to get the name of the input and return that to me. If I just say var name equals input, please get me the attribute name, I can return that value from this function. So let's build out add messages. That will be a function that takes the form, the element, the input name, and what it needs to do is essentially build this HTML string. Instead of me trying to type that out, I'm going to paste that in. So the markup that I want is I want a div with a class of help block with an attribute ng messages equals. I can get the name of the form from the form controller. It has a $name property. Then do a dot and the name of the input, and then $error. Now the tricky part is that I cannot simply do element.append on these messages. I could do that if this was just plain simple HTML, but because this markup contains directives, I'm going to need to use the compile service and have it compile this HTML, associate a scope with this HTML, and then it's the compile service that will give me something back that I can append to the element. But now we're going to need access to the compile service. The easiest way to do this, well, the only way to do it in this scenario, is to inject the compile service to my directive function. I'm going to need to pass it to the linking function, and I'll do that by invoking the linking function. What I will have this do now is, instead of being a function that I execute immediately, I will now have it take compile and return the function that we had defined before. So the function that takes scope, element, attributes, and form. That's the real linking function here. What I'm doing with this outer function is really building that linking function and forming a closure around $compile so I have access to that. Let me also pass along then compile. And when I compile, I have to compile against a specific scope. So that just means add messages will now take compile and scope. And what I will append is the return value of compiling messages and invoking the function that compile gives me back against the current scope. So if you've never used compile before, it can be a little bit crazy, but essentially I need to compile this markup because it has directives inside. If I just append that markup into the DOM, those directives aren't going to be active. And the way you use compile is to compile a particular piece of markup that will give you back a function, the linking function that you need to invoke with the scope object. And once you have associated your compiled HTML with a specific scope, then it's time to append it into the DOM. So with all this in place, let me save everything and come back and refresh our page. And now all I need is a form input directive, and I will automatically get validation messages for all the different validation scenarios that I have inside of that template. However, they don't really stand out So let's see if we can apply some Bootstrap validation classes to make messages appear in green or red. We'll do that in the next clip.